Okay, so it's not clear why the projector on that side of the room is not on, nor do there seem to be any remotes for these projectors up here. Okay, so today, we're going to continue talking about healthcare expenditures, and then we'll start to talk about basically like effectiveness, healthcare effectiveness, so what you actually get for spending on healthcare. If you're on the far left side of the room, you might want to sort of move over, given that the left-hand projector is out of service at the moment. And if you have a problem set, just turn it in at the end of class. So on Monday, we were talking about essentially why healthcare spending is so much higher in the United States than in other countries, particularly other developed countries. We said it was sort of a mixture of both prices and quantity, so we consume more care, and we also basically pay more per procedure, pay more for the care that we actually consume. And so I sort of ran down a bunch of reasons why prices tend to be higher. But sort of the first order question in terms of thinking about why we should care about this from a policy perspective is, basically, okay, so let's suppose that prices, or let's assume, take it as given, that spending is substantially higher. Is this necessarily a bad thing? We'll talk about that in a little while. But even just thinking about sort of healthcare costs in total, are these things that we should care about? In particular, so healthcare costs are there's something that probably the price really isn't that salient to most people most of the time, I think. And there's several reasons for that. First of all, if you're healthy, then you generally have pretty low healthcare costs because you're not going to the doctor. In particular, you're not ending up in the hospital or anything like that. So at any given point in time, for most people, especially people under the age of 65 or so, healthcare costs really aren't all that high. It's just sort of a subset of people, or like a small fraction of people at any given point in time who are incurring substantial healthcare costs, and those costs are very, very high. So if you just kind of think about the distribution of spending, it's not so clear that sort of at any given point in time, the majority of people would care all that much sort of about how high costs are. Now, to some extent, so that would be true if everybody were just paying out of pocket, but where most people are not. So most people have insurance. So insurance should, in theory, sort of spread the costs around among even them out among the entire population. That's kind of the point of insurance, is to have risk sharing. And so you would think that, okay, well, even if people aren't going to the doctor themselves and ending up in the hospital themselves, they're still going to care about healthcare costs because their insurance rates will go up. But again, for most people, you don't really sort of face an actual insurance premium that you end up paying on an annual basis. And the reason for that is that the sort of two main providers of insurance in the United States are, first of all, employers. So most people who are working have healthcare benefits through their employers. We'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But from the employer standpoint, or for people who have healthcare through their employers, you do end up generally paying some premium. So UC, I don't know exactly what fraction of my premium they're paying right now, but I think I pay something like maybe about $200 to $250 per month to cover myself and my daughter. And then UC pays the rest. They're paying probably at least 80%, if not more. So it's not that you necessarily see zero cost if you're getting healthcare through your employer, but the employer will generally pay the majority of it, so you don't necessarily perceive it as a cost. And then even the fraction that you do pay is generally just deducted from your paycheck, sort of like taxes. So in that sense, I think it's also sort of less salient. You get whatever paycheck you get. It's always much less than whatever your gross pay is because there's substantial deductions for taxes and then also for healthcare. And so I think people tend to not really sort of pay so much attention to that specific cost. So if it's being provided by the employer, the cost is generally, I wouldn't say hidden from individuals, but it's certainly less salient to individuals. And then if it's being paid by the government, so in particular Medicare, which is essentially the health insurance that almost all people over the age of 65 in the U.S. use, that's funded by the government. So people sort of don't see any cost at all there except for whatever co-payments they have to make. And then to a lesser degree, there's also Medicaid, which is sort of jointly provided by the federal government and the states, and that typically provides healthcare for sort of families who are lower income. So for most people, you're not actually buying insurance with your own money out of pocket. So healthcare costs tend not to be that salient, even though they do make up 15% of the economy now. But I think that people should. I think there's strong arguments as to why people should really care about healthcare costs. So that remains true regardless of sort of whatever your political orientation is. So conservatives should theoretically want to reduce government expenditures. The fastest growing major part of government expenditures at the federal level are healthcare costs, so in particular Medicare. If you sort of think about long-run budget problems for the U.S. government, they all pretty much come down to Medicare and to a lesser degree Social Security. So you'll hear stories, or you'll hear people say Social Security is not going to exist in 60 years, it'll go bankrupt. That's very unlikely. It's probably true that sort of at current payroll tax rates and current benefit rates, they will not be able to provide full benefits to people even my age, let alone your age. But that at the same time doesn't mean that it would just go bankrupt. Basically, what it means is they could cut benefits by a modest amount, and they could increase payroll taxes by a modest amount, and the thing would be solvent sort of in perpetuity, at least in terms of the forecast. Medicare, though, is much more difficult to potentially fund, just because healthcare costs continue to grow faster than the rate of inflation over sort of a decades-long span now. And so as long as that happens, you're going to have the Medicare section of the budget just continue to outgrow really the rest of the economy, which is basically the available tax base for the federal government. So one way or another, they'll need to sort of arrest the growth in Medicare spending if they want to ever sort of balance the budget in the long term. Ironically, as we sort of when there was when PPACA, Obamacare, was going through, there was sort of a lot of political jockeying going on, and I don't know whether they sort of truly believe this, but the Republicans certainly found it politically expedient to essentially campaign against Medicare cost controls. So cost controls were part of the Obamacare legislation. Again, those are probably necessary in the long term in order to balance the budget, but they're not politically popular because nobody wants to think that they're going to be prevented from getting every single procedure they could possibly want, which is what some sort of cost controls would imply. So Republicans basically campaigned against Obamacare largely on the basis that it would impose cost controls in Medicare in the sort of longer term, which sort of ironic because that would essentially guarantee you don't have any cost controls that guarantees that the government is going to continue to outgrow the economy, which you think conservatives would be against. But now, if you're sort of on the other side, so these are sort of two extremes. So we'll assume that moderates will sort of be interested in controlling expenditures. But on sort of the other side, if you were sort of an extreme progressive, you might say, well, I also don't care about healthcare costs because I think that sort of government expenditures for social services are too low anyway, and so I'm not opposed to spending more on health, basically. Plus, a lot of healthcare costs are paid by employers, so Medicare is a very large share of healthcare costs, but I think employer-provided insurance is still larger than that in terms of the total amount of money that goes in. And so if you're sort of thinking of the employers paying it, then maybe you don't really care one way or the other because you could think, oh, well, it was kind of their profits or something like that. But even if you sort of took that kind of like straw man view, which I don't think most people would have even progressive, there's still a standard issue of opportunity costs, right? So there's always alternative uses of funds. If you're spending more on Medicare or on Medicaid, that means you are spending money that could instead have been used for education or housing or transportation. And it's very unlikely that in the present climate, taxes will either rise enough to cover all of the potential increases in healthcare costs, or that it would only crowd out, say, something like military spending rather than education. I mean, military spending is a substantial portion of the federal budget, but it's actually substantially less than Medicare right now. So even if you were sort of even if you kind of sort of like, well, I don't really believe in military spending, and so we just reprogram all military budget into Medicare, that still over the long run would not be enough to necessarily fund Medicare for the next, say, 50 years or anything like that. So on the sort of government spending side, there are sort of clear limits to how much spending can rise without either crowding out other programs or requiring really substantial tax increases that just aren't very likely in the current political climate. On the other side, though, so thinking about employer-provided healthcare, I think it's important to think about exactly who ends up paying for employer-provided healthcare, because first of all, I think that's just it's kind of useful from like an equity standpoint to understand whether it's sort of labor versus employers that are paying for healthcare, and then it's also going to be important for understanding then how something like a universal care system that's funded through payroll taxes might differ in terms of the sort of distributional implications from the sort of current system where we have employer-provided healthcare. So economists generally believe that healthcare costs are effectively basically like a direct tax on labor that's not really borne by the employer. So even if you just read sort of newspaper stories, you'll sort of see references to healthcare costs being passed on to workers, and so sometimes that'll literally the healthcare costs will be passed on to workers in the sense that the employer will say, before you were paying say $50 of healthcare or health insurance premiums every month, and costs have gone up, and so now we're going to require you to pay like $100 or $150. So in some cases, literally, it is being taken directly out of the employee's paycheck. But even when it's not like literally being deducted from the employee's paycheck, we still generally think of it as essentially coming out of the employee's wage. So let's suppose that labor is the only variable cost for the firm, and that the labor market is competitive. So if there are other variable costs here, that really doesn't change the story. So the profit maximizing firm, or a profit maximizing firm, is going to set employment at a level at which essentially the marginal cost of hiring an additional worker is equal to the marginal benefit of hiring that worker, which is really the marginal revenue. And the way that we think about that, or the way that we think about marginal cost with labor, is essentially, so if we're not thinking about benefits, then we think of sort of wages, the worker's wage as being the marginal cost for the firm. But in fact, most people work at jobs that do have benefits. The benefits, of course, cost money for the employer to provide. And so the marginal cost of adding an additional employee will be both the wages that you have to pay to that employee plus the benefits package, or the cost of the benefits package that you have to provide to that employee. So you're going to continue employing or hiring new workers up until the point at which that wage plus benefit, that marginal cost, is equal to the marginal revenue that having that additional worker generates. So the reason for this, the reason that that's the profit maximizing quantity of labor to provide is the same reasoning that we've seen in many other cases where we're doing marginal analyses and end up equating like marginal benefits equal to marginal cost in some way or another. So if you suppose that the firm chooses an employment level such that the wages and benefits that they pay to the marginal worker are less than the marginal revenue of hiring that additional worker, then of course they can increase their profit by hiring another worker because they're going to make more revenue than they have to pay in cost for this worker. So if that's true, then they're going to always want to increase hiring. On the other hand, if it's the case that the firm chooses an employment level such that wages and benefits for the last worker they hired are actually higher than the marginal revenue than that last worker generates, then in that case they could actually increase profits by decreasing employment, right, and sort of laying off a couple workers because those last few workers aren't actually generating as much revenues as they're costing to the firm. So if that's how the firm behaves, and there's a competitive labor market, then in this simple model, the full cost of the benefits is going to really be borne by the workers, not by the firms. And the way to see this is essentially just looking at kind of the firm's demand for labor and the labor supply. So the downward sloping curve there that looks like a demand curve, basically you can think of it as being the firm's demand for labor. That's the marginal revenue curve, which shows you, so on the x-axis you have the number of workers that the firm is employing, and that downward sloping curve is the marginal revenue curve. So you get the most marginal revenue from the first worker that you hire, and then the next most from the second worker, and the next most from the third worker, and so forth. And eventually you have so many workers that you're not actually getting any marginal revenue from them anymore. Basically your business is like overstaffed, and there's nothing that the workers can really do to either boost production or increase sales or whatever. So that's the marginal revenue curve. Then the supply curve of labor, again, because this is like a competitive market where there are many firms and many workers, the supply curve for labor is just flat. So the supply curve there is that flat curve that is equal to wages plus benefits. So it's going to be the total cost of compensation. And then there's going to be this triangle that's basically above the supply curve, but below that marginal revenue curve. So you're going to end up hiring n-star workers, which is the profit maximizing number of workers to hire. You are getting some profits, right? Because the marginal revenue of the workers that you hire up until you get to the n-star worker is higher than the wages and benefits that you're providing to them. So there is some profit there, but then that profit has to go at least partially towards covering the fixed costs of the firm, and then potentially after that's done, after you cover the fixed costs, then maybe there's some profit left over. So let's suppose that the cost of benefits increases from B to B prime. So initially what's going to happen is that employment is going to drop from n-star to n prime, and then profits will also fall. So this is basically, what we're describing here is a case in which, say, the cost of providing health insurance for the employees goes up by 50% over the next year, or the next 5 years, or whatever time period you want to think about. So wages remain fixed, but the benefits costs go up, and so the curve shifts upwards. The firm responds by reducing the number of employees that it has, but now you actually have sort of a pool of unemployed workers, right? Because the assumption here is that this benefit cost shock is hitting all firms, not just a single firm, which in the sort of scenario we're describing would be true. It's not like benefit, the healthcare costs for University of California keep going up, but it's not anything specific to UC. It's happening across the entire economy. So since this is happening at all firms now, you're going to basically have a pool of unemployed workers because all the firms have reduced their employment levels from NSTAR to N prime. And the only way to return to full employment is basically for wages to fall down to something which we'll call W prime, where W prime is basically just equal to the original wage minus the increase in the benefits costs. So essentially, the benefit or the wages need to fall by the amount that the benefits costs increased, and then you'll get back to a scenario where you have full employment. So the way that would work is that basically workers would be willing, since they're unemployed, they would be willing to accept lower wages than they previously had. Now, in practice, I think there is like a lot of nominal wage rigidity. You don't really see like nominal wages usually falling that quickly at any given point in time, even when we're in a recession and there are a lot of unemployed workers. So the way that I would think about this is not that like literally the nominal wage will fall, but more just that probably what would happen is that wages would not grow as much as they otherwise would have, right? So in general, because of inflation and sort of secular increases in productivity, wages probably grow about 3% nominal terms per year. And so if you just kind of had like flat wages for a couple of years, that would be equivalent to like a 5 or 6% drop in the real wage. Yeah, so I think there's there are potentially like multiple reasons for that. So it's true that one possibility is that you have a minimum wage, benefit costs go up, the wage can't adjust, and so firms are basically reducing their demand for labor. But the other thing that can happen in those cases is that typically, so I think historically, part-time workers have not had full benefits packages. And I think now legally, sort of the number of, now with like Obamacare and everything, so whether you're subject to like specific employer mandates and stuff, depends on the number of hours worked. So I think sort of both sort of de facto and maybe now by law as well, one way for an employer to potentially avoid having to pay for healthcare costs is to sort of employ 2 part-time workers as opposed to 1 full-time worker. So I think that also may sort of be at play there. So you potentially get a lower wage now, W prime, and with W prime plus B prime, basically the net compensation, the net cost of compensation is now back to what it originally was before. It's just that sort of the composition of compensation has shifted. So you have more in benefits now and less in wages, which workers might be okay with if they're actually getting something additional for those higher benefits costs. But if it's just that sort of healthcare costs have gone up and quality of healthcare hasn't really increased, then they're probably not going to be thrilled about that because definitely so the real value of your compensation has just gone down. So that's kind of like the very simple stylized Econ 101, or really Econ 1 here because 101 would be upper division course at Berkeley, model. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification. In reality, the firm probably will bear some of the increased cost of health benefits. So one wrinkle here is now that, so we talked about like, you have an increase in benefits costs, the cost of before wages adjust, the cost of compensation increases. That's going to reduce employment at the firm, which means there's going to be more unemployed workers, and then that pool of unemployed workers will over time like bid wages down to the point at which like the decrease in wages is equal to the increase in the benefits costs. One sort of wrinkle in that story is that it's actually now the case that employment is a less attractive option to the marginal worker. So the mechanism that's going on here is that people who are not economists or in some cases not labor economists are sometimes surprised to find out that being unemployed is not, when we say somebody's unemployed, we don't mean that they're not working. What we mean is that they are not working, but they are actively seeking work. So there's actually sort of 3 types of, when you sort of classify people, there's sort of 3 possible classifications in terms of their interactions with the labor market. So one is employed, which is to say you could be working. Another is unemployed, which is to say that you could be not working, but actively seeking work. So basically trying to work, but failing to find a job. And then the third category is actually what we call NILF, or not in the labor force. So most of you guys are in that category. You're not working, so at least not full time, but you're also not employed because you're not actively seeking work, but instead you're just not in the labor force because you're students. So you could be not in the labor force because you're a student. You could be retired. You could be like a housewife or house husband or something like that. So there's various reasons why you might be not in the labor force. And presumably on the margin, as wages go up and down, that could influence your decision as to whether or not you want to be in the labor force or not, right? So if somebody came to you tomorrow and said that they were going to offer you like $5 million a year to do some job that you really want to do, there's a good chance you probably, but you had to like drop out of Berkeley right now, there's a good chance you probably do that and say like, that's an offer I can't refuse. So at very high wages, people will sort of will leave being not in the labor force and enter the labor force, and at very low wages, the opposite will occur. And so the story that we just described before is one in which employment is actually becoming a less attractive option on the margin, and so some people will drop out of the labor force. So in theory, cash should weekly dominate an equivalent amount of benefits. That actually turns out to not really or necessarily be true for health insurance, and that's something that we're going to talk about a lot like in the next week or so, for reasons that both are sort of due to so on the one hand, there's sort of tax policies that make that the case, and we'll talk about that today. But a bigger issue is what we call adverse selection, and what that will imply is that basically often you're better off sort of being part of a group that gets issued health insurance than you are buying health insurance as an individual in the open market. And that's true even if we sort of take the money that we would have spent providing health insurance for you and just give you that money. So that's a very unusual case, right? Usually like cash is going to dominate any sort of good that we could give you as long as the amount of cash we're giving you is equivalent to the cost of the good, because the worst case scenario is typically that the good is actually something that you wanted and we gave you the cash that you needed or that you would need to buy it, and so then you just buy it and you'd be sort of no worse off. And the best case scenario is that the good is something that you didn't actually want all that much, and in that case it's better to have the equivalent amount of cash than it is to provide you with a good that you don't really want, right? So typically, so what we're thinking about here is a case in which we're sort of swapping out benefits